This video was created using artificial intelligence, AI, for educational and narrative purposes. All characters and events are fictionalized representations inspired by historical realities. Viewer discretion is advised. You were born into a room where the air was heavy with the scent of industrial bleach and the metallic tang of old blood. It was a public ward, a place where the walls sweated condensation and the light bulbs flickered with a rhythmic dying buzz. Your mother's face was a mask of exhaustion, not joy. She did not reach for you with trembling hands of affection. She reached for you because the nurse behind her needed the bed cleared for the next woman in labor. You were a statistic before you were a soul, a weight in a ledger that was already overdrawn. The city outside the window was a gray sprawl of crumbling brick and soot, a landscape that promised nothing but the slow erosion of the spirit. There was no music to greet your arrival, only the sound of a distant siren and the wet cough of a dying man 3 curtains over. You were a byproduct of a system that had long ago run out of empathy, a small, fragile thing cast into a world that viewed vulnerability as a defect. The blankets they wrapped you in were thin and abrasive, recycled through 1,000 previous tragedies, and the milk you drank tasted of bitterness and lack. You did not enter a life, you entered a cycle of maintenance and decay. Your parents were not guardians, they were warnings. Your mother was a woman hollowed out by the same machine that would eventually claim you. She worked double shifts in the laundry of a nearby infirmary, coming home with hands so raw and bleached they looked like bone. When she looked at you, she did not see a future. She saw another mouth that required the labor of her failing joints. She was absent even when she sat across from you, her mind lost in the tallying of debts and the crushing weight of the next 12 hours. Your father was a different kind of absence. He was a man broken by a factory that had discarded him when his lungs turned to lead. A ghost who sat in the corner of the room staring at walls that held no answers. He did not speak to you of dreams or the world beyond the gray horizon. He spoke in the language of resentment, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. They did not protect you from the cold or the hunger. They merely taught you that these things were the fundamental constants of existence. They were not cruel by intent, but by circumstance, their capacity for love having been incinerated in the furnace of survival long before you were conceived. You were useful before you were loved. By the age of 6, your hands were already accustomed to the friction of a scrubbing brush. While other children in distant, wealthier neighborhoods learned the rules of games, you learned the chemistry of lie and the proper way to wring out a heavy, sodden mop. Your childhood was a series of chores designed to keep the household from collapsing under its own filth. You were the one who dressed your father's weeping sores when your mother was too tired to move. You were the one who navigated the predatory lines of the soup kitchen, learning how to make yourself small so the larger, hungrier men would not notice you. Play was a concept you observed from a distance, like a foreign language you could hear but never speak. Your toys were the discarded remnants of the medical trade. Empty glass vials, strips of stained gauze, a rusted basin. You spent your afternoons tending to the needs of the broken adults around you, your worth measured entirely by your ability to minimize their discomfort. You learned early that your own needs were an inconvenience to the people you relied on, so you buried them deep beneath a layer of quiet, efficient obedience. You existed in the margins of the law, a shadow in a city of stone. You were never registered with the central authorities. The cost of a birth certificate was a week's worth of coal, and your parents had chosen the warmth. To the state, you did not exist. You had no papers, no school records, no digital footprint in the primitive ledgers of the time. You were an unperson, a ghost moving through a machine that only acknowledged those with the currency to be seen. No institution existed to protect you from the predations of the street or the negligence of the powerful. If you had disappeared into the dark alleys behind the tenements, there would have been no search, no inquiry, no record of a life lost. You were disposable, a grain of sand in a desert of indifference. You learned to move through the world without making a sound, to avoid the gaze of the men in uniforms who saw only problems to be solved or pests to be cleared. This invisibility was your only defense, but it was also your prison. It meant that when you were hurt, there was no one to call. When you were hungry, there was no one to ask. You were a secret kept by a world that had no use for the truth. The first time you saw a man die, you were 8 years old. It happened in the street, a sudden explosion of violence over a handful of copper coins. The blade was quick, and the blood was darker than you expected, soaking into the dry earth between the cobblestones. No one screamed. The people around you simply adjusted their path, walking around the twitching body as if it were a puddle of rainwater. You watched the light leave his eyes, a slow dimming that reminded you of a candle flickering out in a drafty room. The indifference of the crowd was more terrifying than the act itself. It taught you that life was a cheap commodity, easily spent and quickly forgotten. Violence was not an aberration. It was the punctuation of daily existence. It was in the way the landlord kicked the door down, in the way the police used their batons on the strikers, and in the way the desperate turned on each other in the dark. You realized that the body was a fragile vessel, easily broken and impossible to mend without resources you did not possess. You learned to recognize the smell of gangrene and the sound of a chest rattling with fluid, signs that the end was near and that no one was coming to stop it. There was a woman in the basement of your building, a widow who had once been a midwife. She was the only person who ever looked at you and saw a child. She taught you the names of the herbs that grew in the cracks of the pavement and how to steady a person's breathing when the panic set in. She was the only anchor you had in a sea of apathy. When she fell ill, the system did not care. There was no medicine for a woman with no money. You sat by her bed for 3 days, watching the fever cook the life out of her. You used the techniques she taught you, but they were useless against the magnitude of her decline. When she died, they came for her body with a hook and a pine box, dragging her out like a piece of spoiled meat. They did not ask her name. They did not ask who would mourn her. After she was gone, the last shred of warmth in your world evaporated. You were truly alone, a small figure in a vast, cold landscape, realizing that even the best among us are erased without a whisper. Her death was the final lesson. Attachment was a debt you could never afford to pay. The rescue came in the form of a recruitment drive for the Imperial Nursing Corps. They promised a bed, 3 meals a day, and a purpose. They spoke of the noble calling of healing, of the light that nurses brought to the darkness of the wards. You saw it as a way to escape the crushing poverty of the tenements, a chance to finally be seen by the world. You signed the papers with a shaky hand, believing that you were finally entering a system that valued life. It was a lie, polished and presented with a smile. The institution did not want healers. It wanted buffers. It wanted a layer of disposable labor to stand between the wealthy elite and the rotting masses of the sick. The salvation they offered was merely a different kind of servitude, one that required you to give up your autonomy in exchange for the privilege of watching others suffer. You were moved from the chaos of the streets into the cold, sterile discipline of the hospital, where the rules were absolute and the individual was an obstacle to efficiency. You thought you were being saved, but you were merely being processed into a more useful shape. On the first day of your training, they took your clothes and burned them. They shaved your head to prevent lice and scrubbed your skin until it bled. They gave you a number, 412, and a uniform of stiff white linen that felt like a shroud. Your name was no longer used by the matrons or the doctors. You were simply nurse, or 412. Your body was no longer yours to command. It belonged to the schedule. You were taught to stand when a physician entered the room, to keep your eyes down, and to never speak unless spoken to. They redefined your empathy as a liability, training you to distance yourself from the agony of the patients. You were branded with the institutional mark of the Corps, a cold iron stamp on your sense of self. You stopped being a person with a history and became a tool with a function. Your thoughts were replaced by protocols, your emotions suppressed by the need for clinical detachment. By the time the training was complete, you looked in the mirror and did not recognize the hollowed-out woman staring back. The girl from the tenements was dead, replaced by a silent, white-clad phantom who moved with the mechanical precision of a clock. The hospital was a pyramid of suffering, and you were at the very bottom. At the top were the board of governors, men who never set foot in the wards but made decisions that dictated who lived and who died based on the cost of coal and bandages. Below them were the senior physicians, who viewed the patients as biological puzzles to be solved or discarded. Then came the matrons, the enforcers of the hierarchy, who took out their own frustrations on the junior staff. And then there were you and your peers, the laborers of the flesh. You were the ones who carried the heavy basins of filth, who turned the bed sores of the forgotten, and who bore the brunt of the patient's dying rage. You were disposable. If you collapsed from exhaustion, there were 100 other girls from the slums waiting to take your place. You were taught to obey without question, even when the orders were cruel or nonsensical. You saw how the wealthy were treated in the private wings: silk sheets, fresh fruit, and the undivided attention of the best doctors, while the poor were stacked 3 to a bed in the shadows. The cruelty was not a flaw in the system, it was the design. Your body was a resource to be harvested. You worked 18-hour shifts on feet that were permanently swollen and blistered. You lifted heavy men until your back made a sound like dry wood snapping, a pain that became a constant companion for the rest of your life. You were exposed to every contagion the city could produce: typhus, cholera, consumption. The hospital did not provide masks or adequate protection. Your life was considered a fair price for the continued operation of the ward. Your hands were constantly chapped and bleeding from the harsh chemicals used to sanitize the floors. You were expected to forego sleep, food, and basic dignity to ensure the machine kept running. In the rare moments of rest, you were too tired to eat, your body vibrating with a deep, bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could touch. Your health was a secondary concern to the cleanliness of the linens. You were a battery being drained of its charge, and the system had no intention of ever plugging you back in. You were a tool for labor, a vessel for the suffering of others, and a target for the frustrations of those above you. In the 3rd year of your service, you met Sarah. She was a nurse on the night shift, a woman with tired eyes and a quick, dark wit that the matrons couldn't quite crush. For a brief window of time, you felt a flicker of the humanity you thought had been extinguished. You shared cigarettes in the freezing courtyard at 3 in the morning, whispering about the lives you had before the uniforms. You looked out for each other, swapping shifts when one of you was too sick to stand, hiding the mistakes that the exhaustion made inevitable. She was the first person in years who called you by your name when the doors were closed. In the middle of the charnel house of the ward, you found a small, fragile pocket of connection. It was the only thing that made the grinding misery of the work bearable. You began to hope again, a dangerous flickering thing that made the cold feel sharper and the hunger feel deeper. You allowed yourself to believe that as long as you had this one bond, the system hadn't completely won. You were wrong. The system does not tolerate deviation. Sarah was caught taking a vial of laudanum to give to a dying boy whose screams were keeping the entire ward awake. The rules stated that such medication was reserved for those who could pay or those whose recovery was guaranteed. Compassion was a theft of hospital property. They didn't just fire her, they destroyed her. They stripped her of her uniform in front of the assembled staff, a public shaming designed to remind everyone of their place. She was blacklisted from every medical institution in the city, without a job and with a ruined reputation. She disappeared into the same gray slums you had both tried to escape. A month later, word reached you that she had been found in the river, her lungs full of the same polluted water that flowed past the hospital every day. Her erasure was total. They didn't even bother to update the ledger. They simply drew a line through her number and assigned it to a new girl the next morning. It was a deliberate lesson. Any bridge you build to another human will be burnt, and you will be forced to watch the smoke. After Sarah, the silence in your head became absolute. You could no longer bear the weight of feeling. So you sought the only mercy the hospital offered, the anesthesia of the spirit. You did not turn to the laudanum. You saw what that did to the others. Instead, you turned to a cold, hollow sense of duty. You became the perfect nurse, a machine of bone and starch. You moved through the wards without seeing the faces of the people you treated. You heard their pleas for water or mercy as nothing more than background noise, like the hum of the ventilation. You adopted a numbness so profound that you could watch a child die and feel nothing but a mild annoyance that the bed needed to be changed. You told yourself this was professionalism, but it was actually a slow suicide of the soul. You followed the rules with a religious fervor, not because you believed in them, but because they provided a structure for your emptiness. You survived, but you were no longer alive. You were a husk, a walking monument to the system's ability to hollow out a human being from the inside. Your death was as unremarkable as your birth. You were 52, though you looked 80. Your heart, strained by decades of stress and the physical toll of the wards, simply stopped beating in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. You were in the supply closet, reaching for a fresh roll of bandages. You collapsed against the shelves, the plastic crinkling under your weight. No one heard you fall. The hospital was too loud, the screams of the living drowning out the final sigh of the dying. It was over an hour before a junior nurse found you. She didn't cry. She was too tired. She simply checked your pulse, noted the time, and called for the orderlies. They put you on a gurney and wheeled you to the basement, the same basement where you had spent so many years processing others. There was no funeral. There was no moment of silence. Your locker was cleared out before your body was even cold. Your few belongings, a cracked mirror, a single photograph of a blurred face, a pair of worn shoes, tossed into the incinerator. You died in the very building you had given your life to, and yet your presence left no more impact than a shadow passing over a wall. 100 years later, the hospital is a museum of medical progress. Historians write books about the great physicians of your era, praising their bold discoveries and steadfast leadership during the Great Plagues. They display the instruments you cleaned and the uniforms you wore, but they never mention the women who inhabited them. In the grand narrative of the institution, you do not exist. Your name is not in the history books. Your suffering is not recorded in the archives. The records praise the efficiency of the nursing corps and the unprecedented survival rates of the wealthy patients, while the mass graves of the poor and the broken staff who tended them remain unmarked and forgotten. The system you served continues to thrive, having evolved into newer, more sophisticated forms of the same hierarchy. The walls have been repainted, and the lights no longer flicker, but the machine still requires the same fuel of silent, disposable lives. The world has moved on, and in its wake, you have been erased so completely that it is as if you never drew a single, difficult breath. The wheel turns, the grind continues, and the silence remains.